It was July 7, 1935, when Colonel Joseph Stilwell stepped off the train in Peiping. He had come back as the American military attaché, a full colonel with a new assignment. The day before he arrived, the Chinese government had signed the Ho-Umezu Agreement. That document removed all nationalist troops from Hopei province and handed effective control of North China to the Japanese. Another piece of Chinese sovereignty had fallen away without a shot fired in its defense. Japan's Kwantung Army had been tightening its grip for 2 years, ever since the Tanku Truce halted their last military advance. Now they insisted that all anti-Japanese officials be removed and puppet substitutes installed. General Ho Ying-chin, the Generalissimo's own deputy in Peiping, had signed the conditions. A campaign of steady intimidation was underway, with the object of detaching North China as an autonomous state like Manchukuo. The Japanese strutted through the streets, knocking Chinese out of their way with rifle butts and issuing fire-eating statements about their divine mission to lead the peoples of Asia. The question hanging over everything was simple: could China resist what was coming? Joseph Stilwell had been sent to find the answer. His job was to study the host country's military capabilities and intentions, to keep the War Department informed of every development of significance. 12 miles west of Peiping stood an ancient stone bridge with parapets adorned by marble lions, built 800 years ago, known to Westerners as the Marco Polo Bridge. Soon it would become a symbol of everything that was about to shatter. Throughout the following year, Stilwell traveled widely to assess the situation for himself. In April 1936, he journeyed through the interior of South China by bus, car, riverboat, ferry, and foot. He found the people numerous and the conditions terrible. In June, he traveled the east-west Lunghai railway line from Suzhou to Kaifeng and Luoyang, locating and identifying army units. His conclusion was stark: there was no evidence of planned defense against further Japanese encroachment. No troop increases, no drilling, no maneuvering. On December 12, 1936, the answer to China's prospects seemed more desperate than ever. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by his own commander, Chiang Shui-liang, the young marshal of the Manchurian exiles. Chiang had traveled to Xi'an to personally oversee a final campaign to destroy the communists. Instead, he found himself a prisoner, and his death was expected at any moment. The crisis appalled China and stunned the world. The foreign military attaches were ordered to Luoyang, the nearest nationalist base to Xi'an. Stilwell reached the city on Christmas Day, just as the Generalissimo, followed to universal astonishment by his former captor, flew in by plane. The kidnapping had been resolved, but what it exposed was deeper than any one event. Stilwell reported that Chiang had agreed to halt the anti-communist campaign and form a nominal united front against Japan. Yet he saw no real military preparation anywhere. In June of 1937, Stilwell set out on another journey, this time to Suiyuan and Inner Mongolia with his friend Colonel Sabatier, the French military attaché. The trip took him through territory where Japanese influence was spreading daily. He studied the disposition of Chinese troops and the state of their training. What he found confirmed everything he had feared. The Chinese army was undertrained, under-equipped, and poorly led. Stilwell had come to know the Chinese soldier as excellent fighting material, hardy and uncomplaining, able to endure long hours, scanty food, hard work, and sickness without complaint. But the educated officer corps, he noted, was not martial in spirit. The professional leadership was incompetent. The system did not reward initiative, and the Generalissimo himself kept his subordinates in the dark because he did not trust them. China, Stilwell concluded, had neither the leaders, the morale, the cohesion, nor the coordinated training to fight a modern war. Yet he did not give up on the Chinese soldier entirely. He had studied the 19th-century campaigns of the imperial general Zhou Sung-tang, who had suppressed a massive rebellion in Chinese Turkestan. That campaign, Stilwell wrote, offered a lesson for those who believed the Chinese had degenerated beyond hope. Combining caution with daring, initiative with perseverance, Zhou had shown a complete grasp of the situation and executed well-planned actions with prompt and vigorous pursuit. The Chinese soldier, properly led, could be the equal of any army in the world. The question now was whether the leaders would ever allow him to prove it. The party on Peihai Lake that evening seemed touched by an enchanted stillness. Lanterns glowed on a Chinese barge poled by silent boatmen across the dark water under a full moon. Ambassador Johnson brought his guitar and played an old favorite song as the boatmen paced the deck. Stilwell and his wife were there, along with their daughter and friends from the embassy. Then another boat glided past, carrying a group of Japanese officers, and Colonel Marston mentioned that Japanese troops would be leaving the city that night for maneuvers at the railroad bridge at Lukuchiao. That bridge was the Marco Polo Bridge. It was the last railway link to piping not under Japanese control, a key junction where a shuttle connected to the Tientsin line. By 8 o'clock the next morning, Stilwell's office learned there had been a skirmish there in the night. Japanese troops claimed they had been fired on by Chinese garrison soldiers near the bridge. Now they were besieging the nearby town of Wanping with mortar and artillery fire, demanding the surrender of the officers they blamed. Stilwell sent his assistant, Major David Barrett, to drive out and investigate. Barrett found a dead Japanese soldier guarded by a platoon, and knew immediately this would become the pretext for extreme demands. Within days, Japanese reinforcements were pouring through the Great Wall into Hopei province at the rate of 10,000 men. Troop trains passed through Shanhaiguan at half-hour intervals. Stilwell organized an intelligence network using his 5 senior language officers, his sons serving with the 15th Infantry in Tientsin, and journalists and consuls who could gather hard details from the fog of rumor. He adopted an unorthodox practice for a military attaché. He kept a file of his reports on the table in his office for journalists to consult, wanting the world to see the true picture of Japanese aggression. The war entered the Yangtze Valley in mid-August, but not by Japanese design. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek deliberately precipitated battle at Shanghai, the great international city with its large foreign investments. He sent his best German-trained divisions down from Nanking to the borders of Shanghai, hoping to draw the Western powers into the conflict. The Japanese had a marine garrison in the international settlement and warships in the river, but they had not intended to fight a major battle there. Now they were provoked into a furious response. They landed troops and pushed forward, and suddenly found themselves thrown back under heavy Chinese attack. For 3 desperate months, under incessant bombing and naval shelling, Chinese forces held their lines in the most visible and costly battle the world had seen since 1918. Stilwell observed from piping, noting Chinese courage and Japanese brutality alike. He dispatched assistants to gather frontline intelligence, including Marine Captain Evans Carlson, who was reporting directly to President Roosevelt. Carlson wrote vivid accounts of Chinese soldiers fighting with a will to resist that surprised every foreign observer. The defense of Shanghai made the world China-conscious for the first time in the war. Journalists flocked to the drama and reported tales of heroism, blood, and suffering that stirred American sympathy. Yet the cost was terrible, greater than any battle since Verdun. When the order for withdrawal finally came, Japanese reinforcements had already landed down the coast to outflank the line of retreat. Under enemy fire, the retreat became a catastrophe. 60% of the force was lost, including 10% of China's entire trained officer corps. Nanking fell on December 13th in circumstances of horror that stunned even a world already numbed by war. Japanese soldiers hacked, burned, bayoneted and murdered through the capital for weeks, killing at least 42,000 civilians by the count of foreign witnesses. Groups of men and women were lined up and machine-gunned or used alive for bayonet practice, while officers watched. Missionary doctors collected evidence that filled church publications in America. On the same day, the USS Panay was bombed and sunk by Japanese aircraft a few miles upriver from the capital. 2 Americans died and 48 were wounded. One of Stilwell's assistant attaches, Captain Frank Roberts, was aboard the Panay. After the captain was wounded, Roberts took charge and led the crew's escape to shore. The Japanese had been given maps showing the exact location of every American vessel in the Yangtze. Stilwell's recorded reaction was characteristically terse. "Panay bombed and sunk yesterday. Great to-do." He was furious when he learned the ambassador had known Roberts was safe since morning, but had not told him. The next day, the Japanese apologized, claiming they could not see the insignia. "The bastards," Stilwell wrote in his private notes, and he did not mention the Panay again. But the necessary swallowing of this incident by his own country added to his black mood. The United States accepted the Japanese apology within 10 days. No one in Washington wanted war. Stilwell moved to Hankow, now the capital of unoccupied China, and found the city a chaos of thousands rushing around like ants on a hot rock. Officials, journalists, profiteers, and refugees filled every available space while the wounded lay in the railway stations, unwanted and ignored. Then came Taya Chuang. In early April 1938, Chinese forces under General Li Sung-jen won the first real victory of the war, inflicting 16,000 Japanese casualties and capturing 40 tanks, 70 armored cars, and 100 motor vehicles. The whole country went mad with joy. For the first time it seemed the Japanese were not invincible. Stilwell traveled to the front to see for himself. He talked with General Li Sung-jen and toured the battlefield. The Chinese had fought bravely and held their ground, but when the moment came to pursue the broken enemy, they did not move. The German military advisors were tearing their hair at the frustration of their battle plan. Stilwell wrote in his report that the Chinese could not get the idea of the offensive into their heads. They had their best opportunity of the war and let it slip away. If they would attack at night, he argued, they could nullify Japanese superior gun power by reaching the enemy positions at daylight, but they would not. The old habit of outlasting the enemy rather than defeating him in battle held firm. Yet the battle confirmed something else that Stilwell had long believed. When properly led, Chinese soldiers would fight and die with a courage equal to any troops in the world. The problem was not the men in the ranks. It was the leadership that wasted them, the system that did not reward initiative, and the commanders who hoarded their reserves instead of committing them to win. By June 1938, the Japanese were driving toward Hankow from the north. They had broken through the Chinese lines and were crossing the Yellow River above Kaifeng, threatening the entire region between the rivers. In a desperate gamble, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the dikes of the Yellow River blown near Chengchao behind the Japanese vanguard. The order fell to General Shang Chen, commander of the 20th Army Corps. He delayed until his own army could move out of the way. Then the dynamite was exploded. For agonizing moments, the silt-filled waters flowed steadily on their old course, swirling against the broken dikes. Then suddenly, with a terrible roar, the river ripped through the breach and spread eastward to the sea. 11 cities and 4,000 villages were flooded. The crops and farms of 3 provinces were ruined. 2 million people were rendered homeless, driven from their land to wander as refugees. The Japanese advance was bogged down in the vast, sodden wasteland. Perhaps 3 months were bought for China's defense. Stilwell noted the desperation of the measure. The Yellow River, China's sorrow for centuries, had been called upon to do what the Chinese army could not. The cost in human suffering was incalculable, and another fund of bitterness was stored up against the government among the people who lost everything. But the Japanese were stopped, at least for now. The climax came in October 1938. In the last 5 days of that month, the Japanese took not only Hankow but also Canton, China's last access by sea to the outside world. Canton fell like a ripe pear in autumn, without serious opposition. Negligence, corruption, and some treachery had opened the path, and the great southern port was lost. Stilwell witnessed the collapse and the mass migration that followed. A steady, trudging stream of people carried factory machinery, government records, university libraries, and hospital equipment westward into the interior by boat, cart, pack animal, and shoulder pole. He watched a single coolie trot by with a length of pipe over his shoulder and a boiler pulled along on wooden rollers by teams of straining men. Some machines traveled 500 miles before being set up again in caves dug into the cliffs along the Yangtze. In Hankow, Stilwell met representatives of the communist forces who had come to discuss cooperation in the national resistance. He found Chou En-lai and Ye Qian-ying uniformly frank, courteous, friendly, and direct. In contrast to the fur-colored, spurred Kuomintang officers full of pose and bumptiousness, these men were intense and energetic, uncorrupted by power. He developed a grudging respect for their discipline and organization. The communists were poorly armed and equipped, yet they seemed to know what they were fighting for. They did not press gang soldiers, they paid them. They did not let them prey on the civilian population. This presented a very strong contrast to the territory under the control of the Nanking government. Stilwell noted the wide chasm between these men and the Kuomintang generals he had dealt with. The last months in piping under Japanese occupation were bitter. Japanese officers rode through the streets on horses always too large for them, which they could not mount without assistance. Groups of Japanese schoolchildren toured the Temple of Heaven and the Summer Palace. The American embassy was buzzed by Japanese planes at 150 feet to show what they thought of the United States. Stilwell drew up a private balance sheet of Japanese qualities. He allowed them 6 good traits: industrious, brave, persevering, organized, disciplined, and patriotic. Against these, he listed 26 bad qualities: arrogant, cynical, truculent, ruthless, brutal, stupid, treacherous, lying, unscrupulous, unmoral, unbalanced, and hysterical. He was quite ready to retire and go to Carmel. He wrote home, but duty required him to persist. On May 1, 1939, the Stilwell family left China. On their last day aboard the riverboat from Tientsin to Taku, they joined a friend for a picnic lunch on deck. As they opened their basket, they saw floating by the drowned body of a man clutching a drowned child, still attached by a rope to a piece of wood used as a life preserver. It had been inadequate. Without a word, the group picked up their lunch and went below. 3 months later, on August 3, 1939, Stilwell was aboard ship approaching Honolulu when a radio message reached him. He learned that General Marshall, newly appointed acting chief of staff, had sent his name up for promotion to brigadier general. "It can't be true," he said to his wife. "Do not say a word about it." Suddenly, the long frustration of the past years seemed to dissolve. He had not been forgotten after all. The army was preparing for the war that was coming, and it wanted him in command. In September 1939, Brigadier General Joseph Stilwell stepped off the train at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. He had not set foot on American soil for nearly 4 years, and the world he returned to was already at war. Germany had smashed Poland with terrifying speed, and the American army was still ranked 19th in the world behind Portugal. Stilwell took command of the 3rd Brigade of the 2nd Division, a unit that existed mostly on paper. He found a force with wooden rifles, obsolete equipment, and barely enough ammunition for a single day of combat. The muddy fields of Fort Ord, where thousands of draftees would soon learn to fight, were still just a vision in the War Department's plans. Stilwell drove his new command without mercy. He believed the United States could not avoid war forever, and he had seen with his own eyes what the Japanese did to an unprepared enemy. He lectured his officers on the lessons of China, the need for night attacks, the value of surprise, the absolute necessity of initiative. He pushed them through field exercises in rain and freezing mud, often marching alongside the men. When a young officer complained about the pace, Stilwell reportedly said, "You can rest when the war is over." But even as he trained soldiers in Texas, his thoughts never left Asia. He knew the clock was ticking. In May 1940, Stilwell led the Red Invaders in the Louisiana maneuvers, the first genuine corps exercises in American history. He had 30,000 men against 40,000 Blues, but he did not play by the rules. He launched his attack ahead of schedule, threw his scout cars across the Sabine River at 3 in the morning, and sent demolition parties to every bridge and crossroads. His troops covered 70 miles before daylight in what one correspondent called blitzkrieg at its apogee. He captured the headquarters of the 1st Cavalry under General Jonathan Wainwright, and by the end of the exercise, every observer knew Stilwell was something different. General George Marshall watched from the stands and said nothing, but he remembered everything. The maneuvers exposed every weakness in the American army. Trucks refused to leave the roads, infantrymen clung to their vehicles, and reconnaissance was poor. Stilwell noted in his diary that a revolutionary form of attack had been developed in Europe, combining dive bombers, heavy tanks, motorized infantry, and parachutists into one coordinated strike. The American response, he wrote, was a flat no. He knew the United States had perhaps a year to catch up, and he was determined to spend every day of that year pushing men and machines to their limit. He did not know it yet, but Marshall had already marked him for something larger. In September 1940, Marshall promoted Stilwell to Major General and gave him command of the 7th Division at Fort Ord in California. The division was built around triangular formations of 3 infantry regiments, a new concept designed for speed and mobility. But the camp was nothing but tents and mud when Stilwell arrived. Barracks, mess halls, and administration buildings were hammered together in weeks, and 85% of the men were draftees who had never held a rifle. Stilwell established a training school for company officers, drilled them in 5-paragraph field orders, and spent 3 or 4 days each week walking the line with green lieutenants. He drove his senior officers just as hard, and those who could not deliver did not last long. In October 1940, a Chinese delegation in Washington requested 500 American planes and pilots to form an air force that could sink the Japanese Navy. The request seemed fantastic, and in truth it was. The United States did not have 500 planes to spare. But the American volunteer group was born from that demand, and a hard-weathered fighter pilot named Claire Chennault was its commander. Chennault had retired from the Air Corps deaf and frustrated, but in China he found a patron in Madame Chiang Kai-shek and a mission that matched his ambition. His Flying Tigers, as they would be called, did not reach their training base in Burma until November 1941. Too late to deter the Japanese, but not too late to fight. Meanwhile, the Lend-Lease Act passed in March 1941, and China was declared eligible. TV Sung established China Defense Supplies Incorporated in Washington, a private corporation that managed the flow of aid. The appetite of the Chinese government for American arms was endless and unrealistic. They demanded 13-ton tanks too heavy for their own bridges and artillery pieces they had no crews to operate. General Magruder, the American military mission chief, reported that the will to fight an aggressive action did not exist in the Chinese army. The central idea of American policy, to empower Chinese to fight Japanese, was founded on a delusion. But the delusion was necessary because the alternative was to admit that China might collapse. By December 1941, Stilwell commanded 3rd Corps, responsible for the defense of the California coast. He had enough ammunition for a few hours of combat and a string of rumors that the Japanese fleet was 10 miles off Monterey. He believed California was beyond Japan's reach, but he also knew that if he was wrong, the cost would be catastrophic. He walked the beaches, inspected the airfields, and argued with the War Department for more of everything. At home in Carmel, he waited for the blow he was certain would fall. He had spent 2 years building a fighting force, but he had not forgotten China. He knew that when the war came, his real battle would be back across the Pacific. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Stilwell was at home in Carmel, California, holding open house for junior officers from Fort Ord. Guests wore civilian clothes, and the surf of the Pacific rolled and crashed beyond the garden. The telephone rang, and his wife answered, her voice suddenly crying out that Pearl Harbor was being attacked. A frantic search for a radio brought the awful confirmation to the stunned room. Within hours, Stilwell was at his headquarters in San Bernardino, commanding the southern sector of the Western Defense Command. He had ammunition for only a few hours of combat and practically none for artillery. Panic rumors swept the coast. The Japanese fleet was 10 miles off Monterey. A periscope had been sighted off Cliff House. He told Washington what he had, and when an officer promised to do his best, Stilwell roared, "The best you can. Fight them off with oranges." The days that followed were a blur of tours up and down the coast, inspections of airfields and harbor defenses, and frantic calls for guards at every aviation plant and railroad tunnel. On December 10th came news that the Prince of Wales and the Repulse had been sunk off Malaya, and on the 11th Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Stilwell wrote in his diary that the sinking feeling in his stomach came at least once a day, and sometimes 3 times. He kept his men training in the field, though many units had been pulled away for guard duty. Then, on December 22nd, a call from 4th Army woke him at 6 in the morning. He was ordered to Washington at once to work on a war plan for an expeditionary force, which the caller implied he was to command. He flew east the next day with his aide and arrived in Washington on Christmas Eve, just as Churchill and his chiefs of staff were settling in for the Arcadia Conference. In the War Plans Division, he learned his objective was to be a landing in North Africa, the operation code-named Gymnast. "Nobody knows where I'm going," he wrote. "This morning it was Dakar, this afternoon it is Casablanca." Through 3 weeks of conferences, the plan bobbed like a cork while the British pressed for commitment and the Americans argued over resources. Stilwell worked in a chaos of clerks, telephones, and secret files, producing variants that were discarded almost as soon as they were written. On January 14th, after a final presentation, Gymnast was postponed. That same evening, Secretary Stimson invited him to his home overlooking Rock Creek Park and said the finger of destiny was pointing to China. On January 23rd, Stilwell received his official appointment as Commanding General of United States Army Forces in the China-Burma-India Theater. He was also to serve as Chief of Staff to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, Supervisor of Lend-Lease, and American representative on any Allied War Council. His primary duty was to improve the combat efficiency of the Chinese army and command such Chinese forces as might be assigned to him. "I'll go where I'm sent," he told Stimson when asked how he felt about the mission. Stilwell listed 8 separate functions and positions on a single sheet of paper. He assembled a staff of 35 officers from the China Gang and his own 3 corps. Colonel Frank Dorn as aide, Colonel Frank Roberts for intelligence, and John Peyton Davies as political officer. 400 technicians and instructors were to follow by sea to train Chinese troops in American equipment and tactics. He knew the task was immense and the chances of real Chinese cooperation uncertain, but he believed in the Chinese soldiers' potential. Marshall did not sugarcoat the situation. He doubted the British could hold Rangoon or even Singapore, and he admitted the China mission was a gamble. "By the time you get there," he told Stilwell, "you may be in command in Australia." Stilwell understood that his mission was to keep China in the war by any means possible, even as the Allied position in Asia crumbled. He wrote only, "Will the Chinese play ball? Will the Limeys cooperate?" Will we arrive to find Rangoon gone? On February 9th, Stilwell went to the White House for his first meeting with President Roosevelt. The president was cordial and pleasant, but Stilwell found him frothy and unimpressive, rambling about a 29,000-mile front and expecting the war to be over in 1943. When Stilwell asked if he had a message for Chiang, Roosevelt talked for 5 minutes searching for something world-shaking to say. Finally, he had it. Tell him we are in this for keeps, and we intend to keep at it until China gets back all her lost territory. Stilwell returned to Carmel for 4 days with his family before departure. He did not express disappointment at giving up the combat command he had trained for. He seemed glad to return to Asia and fight the Japanese he had watched for 5 years. He walked the beaches one last time, then flew to Miami, where his plane sat for 2 false starts before finally lifting off on Friday, February 13th. He wrote his wife, 1942 will be a mess, but if we can keep it rolling for a year, we'll begin to hand it back. The journey took 12 days by Pan-American seaplane and transport, hopping via the Caribbean to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, then north to Cairo and east over Palestine, Iraq and Persia toward India. Every stop brought worse news. On February 15th, while Stilwell was somewhere over the middle of Africa, Singapore surrendered unconditionally. 80,000 troops, half of them British and Australian, went into Japanese prison camps. Stilwell wrote bitterly, "Christ, what the hell is the matter?" In Cairo, he learned that on February 9th, the Japanese had crossed the Salween River and by late February were approaching the Sitang. There, the British brigades were defeated in a shambles, leaving nothing between the Japanese and Rangoon. The American, British, Dutch, Australian command, known as ABDA, was dissolved, and Wavell returned to India. Stilwell wrote in his diary, "The world is crashing," and continued east, knowing he was heading into a collapsing situation. Stilwell stepped off the plane in New Delhi on February 25th into the wreckage of the Allied position in Asia. Rangoon was about to fall, and China's last supply port was threatened. The British were in full retreat through Burma, and the Indian refugees streaming out of Rangoon choked the roads. The wooden desk in his new headquarters was piled with urgent dispatches, each bearing news of another defeat. "They are very jumpy here," he wrote home with deliberate understatement. "There may be trouble ahead." He met General Wavell, who had just arrived from Java, his command dissolved and his back injured. Together they faced a front of 2,000 miles with no agreed plan, no spare troops, and no air cover. The 2 Chinese armies promised for the defense of Burma had not yet moved. Stilwell knew that if Burma fell, all American aid to China would have to come by air over the Himalaya peaks, a route Sung had described as comparatively level, but that Stilwell understood to be probably the most hazardous flight in the world. His immediate tasks were already taking shape. Establishing an air freight route from Assam into China over the Himalayas, building a land road from Ledo in Assam across northern Burma, and somehow training and equipping Chinese divisions to fight. He knew from Magruder's reports that the Chinese army had no will to attack, and that the central idea of American policy was founded on a delusion. He also knew that he was the man sent to turn that delusion into reality. Stilwell did not allow himself to spare. He had seen the Chinese soldier bleed and die with patience that was almost holy. He had seen the communists fight with a discipline the Kuomintang had lost. He believed that given proper leadership, equipment, and organization, the Chinese could be forged into an army that could push the Japanese out of China. The question now was whether he could make that belief into something real before the Allies lost everything in Asia. Evans Carlson would later lead his Marine raiders through the Pacific, his unorthodox methods learned from the Chinese communists. Shang Chen continued to serve, but the old order he defended was crumbling. Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers became legendary, but a bitter feud with Stilwell lay ahead for both men. If you have any personal stories, family memories, or historical anecdotes from the China-Burma-India theater, share them in the comments below. We read everyone. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to support our future historical documentaries. Thank you for listening.